So I am Elizabeth Van Horn, and I'm going to be presenting on my MSUS culminating experience entitled A Sustainability Analysis of Workforce Housing Development Tools. And this will be presented in a white paper from my client, which is the ULI Arizona Task Force for Health, Equity, and Housing Affordability. So the problem that I tackled this semester was the limited supply of attainable and affordable workforce housing in the Valley. So workforce housing is defined as housing that's affordable to households earning between 60 and 120% of the area median income. And the area median income in the Valley as of 2019 was approximately $72,000, just for context. So I decided to kind of look at this problem through multiple lenses. So the first is these dynamic pressures that are manifesting the problem as we see it. And those include displacement, which is the result of environmental gentrification, or quote unquote, green and sustainable investments in communities that ultimately price residents out of their home because they drive up property values. They're not actually holistically sustainable investments in the community then. There's also the underproduction, so we're not producing enough to meet demand. And there's a lack of funding resources specifically for workforce housing in the Valley. And the dynamic pressures are really the result of the root causes, which is the political and capitalistic systems that demand unreasonably high returns on investment for all forms of housing development. It's the federal and state cuts to funding for housing that happen regularly. And it's also the result of state and local policies and regulations in the zoning code that make it more difficult to build workforce housing. So that's sort of the doom and gloom a little bit, the problem, but this is the vision that we're hoping to work towards. So in the vision, you have a lot of these benefits that you would normally see from environmental gentrification being separated from the displacement of residents in their communities. So residents are able to stay in place because we invest in new models for housing that serve a range of incomes. So we can create these sustainable and inclusive communities of opportunity where residents benefit from investments like greater access to public transit, parks, greater walkability, access to jobs, and healthy foods. So that's the vision that we're working towards. And I worked with my client, ULI, and the task force to come up with methods so that we could bridge the gap between the problem and the vision that we're hoping to create. The first step that we took was hosting a solutions roundtable event. We had about 65 plus stakeholders from around the Valley convene in February and talk about how we can create more workforce housing that is attainable and accessible to those residents of the Valley. So I took the notes from that roundtable and compiled them, analyzed them for themes, and then did kind of a broad search or deep research into the tools and the solutions that were produced from that roundtable conversation. And then with the help of the task force, I narrowed the list down to just 6 selected tools for focused research expert interviews. And these were tools that the task force agreed would be particularly viable or helpful in the Valley context. And then I created a sustainability assessment tool that's based on Gibson's core generic criteria for sustainability. And I simplified that into 4 dimensions and used the literature to create categories for each of those dimensions, and then a series of evaluative questions so that I could comprehensively evaluate each of the workforce housing development tools. And see if they're holistically sustainable. And the tools that were selected include missing middle housing models, land banks, public-private partnerships, community land trusts combined with limited equity housing cooperatives, co-housing, and off-site construction models. So the scope of my project has sort of changed and evolved over the semester. In the beginning of the semester, I switched directions for my project almost entirely. And over the course of the semester, I've kind of worked with my client, the task force and ULI, to better serve their needs and make sure that the final product, the white paper, is valuable and actually helps move the Valley forward in terms of workforce housing development and providing regulations and financing for that. But my hope is that this work will also address the needs of the broader community. So that includes developers, financiers, nonprofits, local government, and then of course residents, those who would actually benefit from these housing models. So like I said, my final product for my client is a white paper that I am currently working on finishing up in the next couple of weeks. And this white paper includes information on each of the 6 tools that I did research on. So it will include information on benefits, challenges, and then next steps. And these are presented as a strategy so that the task force and ULI and then any other interested parties can actually, use this white paper to work on developing these tools further and then implementing them in the Valley. And the sustainability assessment served as a tool for evaluating each of my workforce housing development tools to determine where their limitations are and to address those gaps. And one of the most important things that I learned is that there's no silver bullet. These tools are, they work best when they're combined with the other tools that I researched, but also when they're coupled with other tools and policies that were identified during that solutions round. And then of course I learned a lot of things about project management throughout this process. So one is that communication is absolutely I realized I needed to be better about clearly communicating my needs to my client and also understanding their expectations of me. It was a little bit difficult because my client was very open and willing to make this sort of an adaptive learning process and project to adapt and meet the needs of the task force, which was nice, especially in light of COVID, but it resulted in some scope creep and changes to my project that have ultimately led to me extending my work beyond the end of the semester by a couple of weeks. And the last lesson that I learned is that I really need to establish who is going to be the one that holds me accountable, making sure that I meet all the deadlines. And so that's something that I'll do when I work on projects in the future, make sure that I have that person and clearly communicate that with them. And then, of course, everyone has been impacted by COVID-19, but I wanted to highlight a couple of ways that it impacted my project and that it impacts things. So I'm lucky in that it didn't impact my project too much. Really, the only thing that changed is that there were slower response rates from the task force and from ULI and others that I was trying to communicate with, because everyone was going through this, trying to figure out how they transition their businesses and do everything online. And then the Arizona task force is part of kind of a cohort of task forces that are working with ULI National and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so they got together and made some adjustments to the scale timeline for the task forces in general. So that just added some uncertainty to the value and the use for my final product, the white paper. And then I think it's really important that we think about and address the way that COVID is impacting housing. So beyond access to healthcare, we've seen that housing is really the most critical form of protection against COVID. And so we need to be thinking and strategizing how we can respond to the needs of those who are financially strained due to job loss, and make sure that we can ensure that countless families and individuals don't lose their homes once we lift bans on evictions and foreclosures. So we need a plan for that in the future. And the next steps for my actual project, my white paper is part of a larger suite of products that will be distributed by the task force and ULI. So I will be combining my white paper with other work that I'm doing for the task force. And this will be distributed using an outreach strategy that we're currently working on. Some ideas are, having webinars, virtual presentations, virtual kind of roundtables to get community feedback. And then thinking about how we can move this project forward, there's actions that both the task force and future MSS students might take. For the task force, I think we particularly need to think about the financial resources because those are quite limited. So how can we potentially shift where we use resources or create new financial sources? And then I think there's also still a lot of work that could be done to dig into the tools that I profiled. And I think there's possibilities for MSUS students in the future to potentially research them more in depth and then get some of them off the ground, like do a pilot project for some of these tools and see how we can implement them and create more workforce housing in the Valley. Thank you.